And we've finally got through to Dr. Ron from Creation Ministries International. Good afternoon, Dr. Ron.
Good afternoon. We had fun, didn't we?
We did. The call went through. You sounded like you were underwater at one stage. Are you diving?
No, but when I do become a fossil, I might be underwater.
Yes, I've been reading some of your stories that you've been writing, Dr. Ron, and wow, they're interesting. Now, of course, Creation Ministries International, these guys are absolute experts when it comes to, creation, evolution, even dinosaurs and aliens. They can answer all your questions. If you have any, please send them through to us right now. Just text 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. Ron, you have a BA Honours and PhD in geomorphology. You really study the earth. You know a lot about it. Well, tell me, have you been writing any papers recently?
Yes, and you will see them come out soon. I've written one paper. It's in press at the moment on water gaps, which are those beautiful when a river just cuts through a mountain range with indifference. I've got another one, which is something most people haven't heard about, and that's called underfit rivers. When the river doesn't quite belong in that valley, there's a mismatch between its geometry and the valley geometry. That's another one that's coming out. Yeah, a couple of those articles at the moment.
Well, we might as well start with the one you mentioned first. I've seen that where a river goes through a mountain range. How does that work? How come it just doesn't form a giant dam?
Well, that's the question that one has to ask. And particularly, I've been recently to the Finke River in Northern Territory and went out because that is a water gap river. And from Hermannsburg south, it's just a stunningly beautiful water gap with massive sidewalls flowing through that area. And you're right. How does in many respects, why do small rivers, because they really are, even as much smaller rivers than the Finke River, will cut through those mountain ranges? Why do they just cut through as though they weren't there?
Yeah.
When a simple solution would have been to simply, particularly the Finke River, it could have turned to the east and gone around the mountain ranges with a very small rise in water level, but it didn't. It went through them. So that's a question that's been long asked and not being able to be explaining it if you're using, traditional ways of thinking, that everything in the past is the same as it is today. That uniformitarian thinking really doesn't work when you look at these features.
Because, on Google Earth these days, you can see like 3D models. You can see where the mountains are and the valleys are. And to see a river doing that, it sort of doesn't make sense.
It doesn't, particularly when the river comes across one mountain range tilted, say, to the north and another mountain range tilted to the south, and shows equal disrespect for both of them. When you think, how does it cut through different geologies with different structure and still maintain its beautiful meandering pattern? So the answer doesn't lie in, sort of current or contemporary river processes. It's got to be something that happened in the past.
Yeah. So how is it explained?
Well, from my point of view, when the floodwaters, as you know, I absolutely believe in a global flood. When the floodwaters were flowing off the earth, the Lord said, I will raise the land and lower the sea floors. As he raised the land, water just doesn't run off evenly. It very quickly, if you have an agricultural property or even just a small property, you'll notice that water begins to form rivulets and then starts to cut down into little gullies and so on. So you can imagine that as the land was uplifting and all these floodwaters were flowing off, they would begin to flow off in concentrated flow. Not evenly from the surface, but they would begin to concentrate and begin to form giant rivers almost. And carve out these valleys, and what sits in them now is just a remnant of the channel, or of the river, I should say, the flow, compared to what was carved out in the first place.
I sort of see this. I imagine a tank. Somebody turns a tap on, and the water coming out of the tap just hits the ground. It follows that path of least resistance, and it just sort of, it meanders around the easiest way, the lowest point. However, if, the bottom of the tank literally exploded and the water just dumped out of the tank, it would all of a sudden take many different routes and it would carve the ground away.
Yes, I mean that's a good way of looking at it, and I'm talking about the Think River, and you'll see some beautiful images come up on that in the Creation magazine, the Creation Ministries International, their magazine. Beautiful images will come up on that.
Yep.
But the fascinating thing is, even the smallest streams that have catchment areas of maybe where they get their water from, maybe only about a square kilometre, they're that small, but they seem to just cut through mountain ranges with 30, 40 metre canyons, and you go, how in a desert environment does a 1 square kilometre catchment generate that much water that it can carve through an existing mountain range? It doesn't make sense.
Okay, so we understand that a giant flood could do that. How do the geologists that aren't Christian, how do they explain it?
That's an interesting question, Nick, because in the Northern Territory, I think it's either the Geological Association or one of the government departments declares for it to form that sort of structure, it must be one of the oldest rivers on the planet. In other words, it's had hundreds of millions of years to slowly erode that away. Is an argument that is often put up. So what they do is they increase the time available for the river to cut down. But I'm going to say, well, if it cut down, why did it only cut down vertically? Why are those cliff faces still standing there 300 million years later?
That's what I was going to say. I mean, we know over time how the edges tend to erode and fall in, and it ends up being more sort of angular rather than straight up and down. And if it's millions of years old, how did it stay straight for so long?
That's correct. You would see weathering and erosion going on, and so your slope of your gorges would begin to shift backwards or decline, not so steep. Rocks would fall down. Landslides would occur on those sort of very steep cliff faces. And yet they argue that over 300 million years, that didn't occur.
That's very hard to believe, isn't it?
Well, it just doesn't fit, basic logic of processes. When you understand river processes and the river erosion and how it all works, and you see it occurring in all these different rivers all around the world, that you come across these water gaps and it's a completely different world. You've got to look at it from another perspective.
Yeah, and of course you have a PhD in geomorphology. This is what you've studied. You've been looking at this for years and years. You've taught. I've noted here. You've actually worked with Griffith University, University of Sunshine Coast, Queensland, University of Queensland, Turku University in Finland, the Chinese University of Hong Kong in the People's Republic of China. You know all about this stuff, yet you look at their theories and you must just scratch your head.
Now, I will admit it did take time. It did take time for me to do that. And the reason is simple, and that is we are taught to think a certain way. We are taught, if you like, a way of thinking, a paradigm. Let's call it a paradigm, a way of thinking. And it does take years of looking at the evidence in the field, not seeing what you expect, and then opening your mind, well, maybe there is an alternative. And by doing that, I made a number of significant discoveries and had them published as well, which was good. But, you can only go so far. You can't. It's very difficult to change the paradigm. And so I can tell you now that universities will not accept that a global flood of biblical proportions occurred.
Wow, yet it's
Even if
so
ever
much
points
easier
to
for
that.
someone like me. You know, you explain it both ways. Some of these rivers cutting through mountains and having vertical cliffs on either side, it's so much easier to believe in a global flood than the other.
Yes, because there's, let's say, less interpretation. It just seems more clear or more sensible. Let's put it that way. And we need to be challenging ourselves as much as, say, a non-Christian would needs to challenge themselves, because when we look at these things, I'm going to ask the question: were we there when they were created? The answer is no. Can we, let's say, run an experiment and duplicate that feature? Can I go out there now and create a water gap or a canyon? The answer is no. So how do we then understand them? Well, we all, whether we're Christian or not, scientists have to use interpretation, if I can put it that way. In other words, we see pieces of evidence, we weave them together into a story. And for some of those stories, they might say, well, I need hundreds of millions of years. To others of us will go, no, I don't need that. I can give you a more simple story than that. And that is, the Bible said a great flood occurred, a global flood, and yes, there's my answer.
I mean, surely we can recreate these water gaps using the flood method on, I guess, a softer aggregate.
You'll find that difficult, unfortunately, because, I've played with flume studies and those sorts of things before, but then trying to replicate what is out there, which is quite complex, trying to replicate that. We can replicate one aspect of it, perhaps, in a laboratory at a time, or a flume study, or an engineering laboratory at a time. But trying to capture all of it, all the features involved, like water velocity, turbulence, strength of rock, differences in rock layers, all those sorts of things, it does get a bit complicated.
Yeah.
And so as much as we try, we actually still can't, in a sense, be that so-called, let's call it the science that, it's absolutely correct answer. It's the truth.
Yeah.
We all, I mean, I know the media would love to see science as seen as a truth, and a lot of people speak of science as a truth, but I would suggest that most of it, being particularly biological, geological, geophysical, astrophysics, is interpretational. In other words, we have limited data, and we've got to deal with and interpret with what we've got.
Yeah. Well, I thank you today, Dr. Ron Neller, for explaining, the two different theories of how those water, what did you call them, a water gap?
Water gap, yes. Yes, simply a gap that runs through a mountain range, and the river that occupies it either doesn't look right, or, it just doesn't look good for some reason. You don't get a picture that river created that valley.
Yeah.
So beautifully like that. Particularly when you look at some of them, like the Finke River. The Finke River is just beautiful in its structure, its slopes. And so hopefully when I get this article out, when it's published, which should be later this year, I hope, people will be able to look that up on creation.com and have a good look at that and read that article.
Awesome. Of course, creation.com does have thousands of pages of information. If anyone has any questions, definitely go to creation.com and you can just type them into the little search box there. Otherwise, send questions through to us, 0401 949 949, and we throw them at somebody from Creation Ministries International every Tuesday. Dr. Ron Neller, thank you so much for your time again today. It was a pleasure having you.
My pleasure, actually. I enjoy chatting with you, Mike.
Awesome.
Mick,